All right, welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We've had some truly fascinating source material sent to us for today, and it's got me really thinking about those core values that seem to define the Ukrainian spirit, especially as they face such immense challenges. What really struck me is how diverse our sources are. We've got everything from Ukrainian Americans sharing their firsthand experiences and insights to, leaders both within Ukraine and internationally, trying to make sense of this whole situation, plus some really deep dives into Ukrainian culture and their truly remarkable ability to just withstand so much pressure.
Yeah, and I think what makes this exploration particularly relevant for our listeners today is that, we're not just looking at these Ukrainian values in isolation. We're going to be considering how the prominence of those values might actually contrast with what we as Americans, seem to prioritize these days, not just in what we say, but maybe more importantly in what our actions actually demonstrate.
Exactly. It's about going beyond just words and looking at the lived reality. Right?
Absolutely. And our goal today is to really try to grasp those driving forces behind Ukraine's response to these frankly existential challenges they're facing. And in doing so, maybe gain a fresh perspective on our own cultural priorities here in America and how they actually manifest in our own society.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One thing that really leaps out from all this material is this really profound love for freedom and independence among Ukrainians. Like in that Battle of Values video, one of the Ukrainian American speakers, he just lays it out so plainly. He's like, Ukrainians are fighting so fiercely because they want to keep their country, because they deeply believe in and love their freedom. It's not just some abstract political concept to them. It feels like it's deeply intertwined with their very sense of who they are as a nation.
Right. And that sentiment you're picking up on, it really resonates with what we see in that core values document too. Freedom, or Volya, as they call it in Ukrainian, which, that term itself carries a really strong sense of self-determination and willpower. It's not just an abstract ideal for them. It's a cherished value that's been forged over centuries of, frankly, resisting oppression. You think about their constant struggle for independence from the Soviet Union, and now this incredibly determined defense against Russian aggression. This isn't some newfound stance for them. It's like woven into the very fabric of their national story. And I think that deep, almost visceral connection to Volya might help explain the sheer intensity of their resistance that we're witnessing.
It's like this inherent drive within them, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's not just Ukrainians themselves who are framing this in terms of freedom. Like Zelensky in that UATV English video, he specifically points to the strong support they're receiving from Europe as evidence that, they're all essentially standing up for those same fundamental values, including Ukraine's vision for a peaceful future. He sees a real shared commitment to these principles.
Right. Like a solidarity based on these shared values. Pretty powerful stuff.
It is. And it goes beyond just the immediate region, too. Like, even the Prime Minister of New Zealand in that CNBC International Live video, she actually characterizes the entire situation as a contest of values. For them, supporting Ukraine isn't simply about geopolitical strategy or anything like that. It's deeply rooted in this belief in democracy and a rules-based international system, values that they perceive as being very much under threat right now.
So we're seeing this really powerful, almost innate dedication to freedom coming through from all these different perspectives. Now, I'm curious, from your standpoint, how does this level of commitment, this almost ferocity in their dedication to freedom, how does that strike you when you think about the way we talk about freedom and the actions we see in America today? Are there areas where maybe that fierce dedication, doesn't seem quite as evident in our own society?
That's a really thought-provoking question, and it kind of leads us into another fascinating aspect that emerges from these sources, which is this deep sense of community and tradition of hospitality that we see in Ukrainian culture. That core values document, it really highlights this concept of hromada, which it's not just a community in the typical sense. It's a deeply rooted concept of collective action and mutual support, especially when facing hardship. They even have this tradition called toloka, where entire communities come together to help each other out with, significant tasks or challenges.
Right. And you can't forget about the emphasis on hospitality, which is just so central to their culture, right?
Yeah.
That whole tradition of welcoming guests with, so much warmth and generosity and offering them bread and salt. It's this really symbolic gesture. It speaks volumes about their cultural mindset, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And what's really interesting is that this isn't just some, historical ideal that's been relegated to the past or anything like that. Like Timothy Snyder in that Ukraine World interview, he touches on this when he talks about Ukrainians taking risks and making these value commitments together. And it really points to a very strong underlying social cohesion, this sense of shared destiny that seems to run deep.
We even see this reflected in how they're responding to the current conflict.
Hmm.
Like that Ukrainian resilience article, it points out that despite everything that's going on, businesses, schools, even essential services, they're all managing to continue functioning. And the speed at which they're able to restore essential infrastructure, like the railways, for example, after disruptions, it really speaks to a powerful communal effort, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It's truly impressive. And it really goes beyond just individual acts of charity or kindness. It's woven into the fabric of their society. So, thinking about your own experiences and observations, in what ways do we see this same deep-seated sense of community consistently reflected in American society today, beyond those individual acts of kindness? Are there areas where maybe our strong emphasis on individualism, might sometimes overshadow that sense of collective responsibility and mutual support? It's a question worth pondering.
Absolutely, and it makes you really appreciate the strength that can come from that collective spirit. Now, shifting gears a bit, one thing that I found truly remarkable is the sheer resilience and perseverance of the Ukrainian people. And the core values document provides really important context here. It talks about how they've faced centuries of challenges, invasions, famines, political oppression, all of that, and how that whole history has essentially forged this incredible resilience within them.
Yeah, and that powerful phrase, Slava Ukraini, it's more than just a greeting. It encapsulates the spirit of defiance and unwavering hope, especially in the face of adversity. It's like a rallying cry that embodies their enduring spirit.
It's so powerful, and Timothy Snyder in that Ukraine World conversation, he really captures this. He talks about Ukrainians demonstrating this capacity of the impossible, this widespread belief in the future, even while they're dealing with such tragedies. And he even contrasts this with what he sees as Russia's greater focus on the past. It's a really interesting comparison.
It is. And that Ukrainian resilience article, it doesn't just talk about this in abstract terms. It really brings it to life with all these concrete examples. It highlights their commitment to maintaining a sense of normalcy, the creative ways they're adapting to, incredibly difficult circumstances, and that persistent, just unbreakable spirit they have.
Well, absolutely. And we see it in these really poignant individual stories, too. Like the article talks about students like Juliana Yanitska, who's continuing her studies even with air raid sirens going off, and Sophia, who's pursuing her dream of being a journalist despite being displaced from her home. And then there's Anastasia Malenko, who's balancing her demanding studies at Stanford with volunteering to support her country. These aren't just anecdotes. They're real demonstrations of that extraordinary resilience in action.
They really are. And, reflecting on these examples, how does this level of resilience compare to the prevailing attitudes that you see here in America? Are we as readily able to adapt and persevere when faced with, significant national challenges? It's a question worth asking ourselves.
It really is. It's inspiring to see, to be honest. Now, switching gears just a bit, another key aspect that really shines through from these sources is this strong cultural pride and the importance they place on their language. The core values document, it really emphasizes this, pointing out how deeply proud they are of their cultural heritage and how the Ukrainian language itself serves as this really potent symbol of national identity and resistance against external pressures.
Yeah, and it's not just about the language itself. It's about, the whole culture they've built around it. Like they hold their cultural figures like the poet Taras Shevchenko in such high regard, seeing them as these national icons who embody the spirit and soul of Ukraine. It's about actively preserving and celebrating what makes them, distinctly Ukrainian.
And Timothy Snyder, he actually connects this back to the idea that Ukrainian identity is in many ways defined by these universal values like freedom and dignity. He makes this argument that this pursuit of their specific cultural identity doesn't actually contradict embracing those broader liberal values, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, it's a nuanced perspective for sure. And we see this cultural pride being expressed in really contemporary ways too. Like that Ukrainian resilience article, it gives these examples of artists taking traditional Ukrainian art forms like Petrikivka painting and icon painting and using them in these new and relevant contexts like adorning anti-tank barriers or reimagining sacred art on, repurpose ammunition boxes. It's a really powerful way of asserting their cultural identity and raising global awareness about their struggle.
It's like this fusion of tradition and current events,
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you think, given the incredible diversity we have in America, how visible and valued is a unified sense of cultural pride here?
Yeah.
Is there that same level of emphasis placed on actively preserving and promoting, a distinct national cultural identity in the U.S.? It's a really different dynamic for sure.
It is, and it kind of leads us to this really insightful point that Timothy Snyder brings up in that Ukraine World interview, which is the concept of a plurality of values.
Mm-hmm.
He cautions against societies becoming too fixated on a single dominant value because, in his view, if belief in that one value starts to weaken or fade, it can lead to a sort of societal nihilism, which is a theme he's actually exploring in his new book Manuscript, which is pretty fascinating.
It is. And that really contrasts with the rhetoric we hear from Putin in that Daily Mail video, right?
Yeah.
He spends a lot of time criticizing the West for supposedly imposing what he calls perversions and rejecting traditional values, while really empathizing and praising what he defines as Russian values. And that kind of suggests a much more singular and maybe even rigid focus on a specific set of values, wouldn't you say?
It does. It's a very different approach. So, thinking about that contrast, does American society, do we tend to prioritize certain values over others, like economic success, for example? And what might be the consequences if that focus starts to shift, or if those values we prioritize don't really resonate across our diverse population? It's something to consider.
Yeah, those are some really important questions. Now, finally, I want to touch on this relationship between the values that, countries espouse and their international alignment, because there are definitely some potential tensions there. Like we heard Zelensky in that UATV English video emphasizing defending those European values alongside European nations, which points to this sense of shared principles and solidarity.
Right, but then you have the Danny Haifong video, which introduces a more complex dimension to all of this. It reports on Ukraine's decision to ban the Communist Party and other opposition parties. And this raises some really important questions, like how do those actions align with those typical Western democratic values that we talk about, like freedom of speech and political pluralism? And the video also points out that the EU, has generally had a positive response to Ukraine despite these bans, which adds another layer of complexity to the situation.
And to make things even more complex, that Danny Haifong video also highlights this perceived disparity in how far-right and neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine are treated compared to left-wing political organizations, which, further complicates this whole narrative about universally shared values.
It really does. And then you have someone like Richard Branson speaking at that Alliance of Democracies event who offers this perspective that, principles of freedom and democracy are, at their core, universal aspirations. And he emphasizes how a stable and thriving business environment depends on things like good governance, transparency, fairness, and the rule of law, which are values that are undeniably challenged by this whole conflict.
So we're seeing these sometimes conflicting perspectives on values and, the specific political actions that are being taken within Ukraine. And I think it raises a really crucial question for our listeners to consider, which is how do these different viewpoints shape their understanding of the conflict and the values that are truly at stake here? It's clearly not always a straightforward black and white picture.
You're absolutely right. It's a complex situation with a lot of nuances to consider. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just take a moment to summarize some of those key Ukrainian values that have really emerged from our exploration of all these sources. This deep-seated love for freedom and independence, that strong and active sense of community and mutual support. Their truly remarkable resilience in the face of immense adversity, a vibrant and proud cultural identity, and maybe even a more inherent understanding of the importance of a plurality of values within a society.
And throughout our conversation, we've raised several questions for you all to think about. We really encourage you to consider how these values are actually prioritized and demonstrated in American society today. Do our words and actions always align with those values? And what insights can we glean from the Ukrainian experience as we've seen it through all of these different lenses?
And, to leave you with a final thought, consider this. Given Ukraine's incredible commitment to these core values, even while facing such an existential threat, what can we as Americans potentially learn from them about our own values and priorities as we navigate this increasingly complex world? We really encourage you to dig deeper into those sources we discussed today and to continue thinking critically about the values that shape both of our nations.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive, everyone. We'll catch you next time.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening.